The Russian government says Ukraine has fired U.S.-supplied long-range missiles into the country a day after Washington gave its permission for such attacks. The Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine used the Army tactile missile system in a strike on Russia's Bryansk region this morning. In its statement regarding the incident, the ministry says 5 missiles were shot down and 1 damaged, with its fragments causing a fire at a military facility in the region. The strike represents the first time the long-range missiles have been used on Russia's internationally recognized territory and comes shortly after Washington signaled Ukraine had permission to use the missiles into Russia. Let's bring in our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird. Maria, the Biden administration has refused to confirm whether or not it did give its permission to Ukraine to use those weapons. But as the Ukrainian president said, we're going to see whether or not the permission has been given, and it's been confirmed this morning with those strikes. What has been the reaction in Washington to the latest move by Ukraine?
I'm surprised. We know that we're in a very difficult situation right now as it relates to what's happening in our country as far as the election. We know that we are in a time where the Biden administration has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, and we're not quite sure whether or not that will continue throughout the next administration. So I think people aren't surprised. I think the question, though, is what is the basis for this? And obviously, what does this mean next for Ukraine and Russia?
I wonder if the Biden administration, Maria, also discussed the risks to using these weapons, the potential for an escalation of crisis in the region, especially for Ukraine and for other NATO members.
Yes, I mean, there is quite a risk there, and this is happening 2 days after the Biden administration gave the green light to use longer-range American weapons against targets inside Russia. So again, this is, I think something that the Biden obviously is a reporter, but question to the additional risk that could be at hand. And we know this is the 1000th day of the war, and so major escalation was expected. And so U.S. officials are basically saying now that we've fired across the border for the first time. And so this is going to be, I think, the question next is on Sunday whether the U.S. president, when he authorized this, whether or not this will end a months-long prohibition aiming to help Ukraine defend itself and drastically escalate the conflict, and knowing that just here in just a few more months or less, the U.S. will definitely be in a different potential as to their support with Ukraine.
Now, usually at this time, Maria, when something like this happens, the U.S. Senate will be debating whether or not Ukraine should be given the permission, or if the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, was right in giving Ukraine this permission. But it does seem the Senate is occupied with other fish to fry. Republican senators are consumed right now with preparing for a new government come January 2025.
You're exactly correct. In the press briefing on Monday, the State Department stated that their involvement from North Korea troops with the war, major escalation by Russia, which was really part of the reason for the decision. And so, as you can see, President Biden is moving forward with what he believes is best, and that he's responding directly to those measures. And as you said, Senate is very much focused on various bills they're trying to get passed here before December, because once we get to January, it's going to be very hard, and because of the recess that Congress goes on, it'll be very hard to move some things forward. So there's some very key U.S. domestic issues that the Senate is focusing on at this time, while Biden continues his strong standing support, because this is going to be part of his legacy when he leaves office.
Talking about when he leaves office, Maria, where does the Biden administration hope to leave Ukraine when President Donald Trump takes over on January 20?
Well, the Biden administration has for some time, supported and looked for a victory plan alongside the Ukrainian president. And so this is really about them being able to support Ukraine and potentially, seeing an end. I think that it's a bit optimistic, potentially, to think that there's going to be an end before the Biden administration. But the hope from the Biden administration is that they'll be in a much better place than they were previously, and to provide them with as much potential support now directly level with inauguration.
I do apologize to our viewers. Maria does appear to be in transit. Maria, just before you go, President-elect Donald Trump has said before that when he comes into office, he will end the Russia-Ukraine war. He hasn't said how. But has he commented on the recent events? For example, the Biden administration given Ukraine this permission to go ahead and use those long-range weapons? Because, looking at the president-elect, I think he's been preoccupied with personal, activities. He was at the UFC fight over the weekend, and we haven't heard much from his camp regarding some global issues, especially as regards Ukraine.
Yes, what you're going to find is that the president-elect right now is focusing solely internal on his cabinet. And global affairs, as it has been a major area of concern for the Biden administration and focal points, we will likely see some changes in that and the approach to foreign affairs for the U.S. And so he's very much focused domestically. He's very much focused on those key areas that he campaigned for. Obviously, the border is going to be what we're going to hear the most about. Even more so than support in various wars like Ukraine and Russia.
Thanks again, Maria. In the meantime, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been speaking to the country's parliament today, explaining to them the war has reached a decisive moment. His address marked 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion. He said Ukraine would not trade its sovereignty or relinquish its right to its territories, and he ruled out the holding of new elections until peace is achieved. Zelensky set out what he called a resilience plan for the country as a domestic foil to the victory plan that he had pitched to Western allies earlier in the autumn. Though he said the full details of the plan will be disclosed later in the year, it comprises steps to stabilize the front line, support military innovation and arms productions, as well as measures to shore up national unity and cultural identity. President Zelensky later addressed the European Parliament, to whom he talked about the danger of having North Korean troops stationed inside Russia, which could grow to 100,000.
Through oil sales. Putin has brought 11,000 North Korean troops to Ukraine's borders. This contingent may grow to 100,000. While some European leaders think about, some elections or something like this at Ukraine's expense, Putin is focused on winning this war. He will not stop on his own. The more time he has, the worse the conditions become. Every today is the best moment to push Russia harder, and it's clear without certain key factors, Russia will lack real motivation to engage in meaningful negotiations. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales. Oil is the lifeblood of Putin's regime, and the shadow fleet of tankers is what keeps it alive. As long as these tankers operate, Putin continues to kill. Strong sanctions are essential. I thank each of you, thank you, Roberta, again, and thank each of you who supports our people, our resilience, our ability to restore safety even after the most devastating mass attacks by Russia.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asked for the European Union there's more concern for reports of Iran North Korea and China producing and supplying complete weapon systems to Russia for its war in Ukraine. Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell described the war that has left Gaza in ruins as apolitical, calling it a war against the children. The UN Human Rights Office said last week nearly 70,000 of the fatalities it has verified in the war were women and children, and condemned what he called a systematic violation of fundamental principles of international humanitarian law.
By children and women. It's clear that each step that is being left without reaction encourages Russia to escalate further. No reaction, no escalation. They started by weaponizing food, by weaponizing energy, using the winter as an arm. Then they resort to Iranian drones and missiles and military supplies from North Korea, and now even with non-Korean soldiers in the borders of Ukraine. And then they call to China, and the role of China is becoming bigger and bigger. China is today the largest provider of dual-use goods and sensitive items that sustain Russia's military-industrial base. Without North Korea, without Iran, without China, Russia could not support its military effort, could not continue fighting the war. And certainly we are concerned by reports of production and deliveries of complete weapon systems from these three countries, but in particular is North Korea and Iran. Apocalyptical situation in Gaza, where 70% of the death toll is being paid by children and women. 70% of the casualties are children or women. In Lebanon, 100,000 houses destroyed. In Gaza, 2 million people from one side to the other of the strip. The most frequent age of the casualties in Gaza is 5 years old. The most frequent age of the casualties in Gaza is 5 years old. This is a war against the children.
We're staying with Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says more aid and more money is needed to prevail over Russia. He was making the comment as he arrived for a meeting of European foreign affairs ministers in Brussels.
Today marks 1,000 days of the full Russian onslaught, the unprovoked full Russian onslaught on Ukraine. So today we'll discuss how we can help Ukraine to prevail. That means more aid, more money, and we have to make available to them, particularly now that the North Koreans have come on board. And we know that China is helping Russia with the war effort. We know that Iran is supporting Russia with the war effort. We have to ramp up the defense industry, and luckily NATO and the EU are working closely together to make sure that the defense industrial base, transatlantic, will be strengthened over the coming months. We really have to do this, to replenish our stockpiles, to make sure that we stand ready to oppose any adversary.
Speaking of aid, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has announced additional security assistance for Ukraine in the coming days. She said supporting Ukraine in the U.S. Congress and beyond could not and should not be a partisan issue, and that standing up for democracy and human rights was above petty politics and would outlast any one leader.
The United States will continue to surge security assistance to Ukraine, including artillery, air defense, armored vehicles, and other needed capabilities and munitions. And we will announce additional security assistance for Ukraine in the days to come. Because ultimately, supporting Ukraine in Congress and beyond it cannot be and should not be a partisan issue. Standing up for democracy and human rights is above petty politics and outlasts any one leader or term. And so, in its desperation, the Kremlin has turned to the DPRK, first for arms and now for manpower. at least 10,000 soldiers, sent first to eastern Russia and now to the far western Kursk oblasts bordering Ukraine, have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces. It is a move without modern precedent. Not in over 100 years has Russia welcomed foreign troops onto its soil. And it's one in blatant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1718, 1874, 2270, resolutions Russia agreed to only a few years ago. Colleagues, these are the actions of a rogue state. And so rather than try and justify the unjustifiable, Russia simply lies. 1,001 days ago, Russia's representative told us to our face there would be no invasion. As the world watched live broadcasts of Russian forces and tanks crossing into Ukrainian territory and Russian missiles raining down on Kyiv, he continued to insist in this council there was nothing to see here. The lies continued. We were told that no North Koreans were deploying through Russia. Now North Koreans are fighting on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. All the while, this chamber has been flooded with slurs and baseless accusations against Ukraine's democratically elected leaders.
Slovakia has strong feelings about the U.S. allowing Ukraine use long-range missiles in the war with Russia. The country's Prime Minister Robert Fico made his position clear on Monday, saying long-range weapons in strikes against Russia aim to thwart or delay peace negotiations. In his words, as Prime Minister of the Slovak Republic, I express my strong disagreement with U.S. President Biden's decision to authorize the use of long-range missiles on targets in the territory of the Russian Federation with a clear aim of completely derailing or delaying the peace negotiations. I've given clear instructions to both the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Slovak Republic, Jay Blana, and the Minister for Defense of the Slovak Republic, Arek Linak, not to support this American decision in any international forum or in any way. This is an unprecedented escalation of tension, a decision which thwarts hopes of starting any peace negotiations and ending the mutual killings of Slavs in Ukraine. End of quote. Well, Chinese and Russian foreign ministers have discussed bilateral ties, the conflict in Ukraine, as well as the situation on the Korean Peninsula. This has happened on the sidelines of the Group of 20 meeting in Brazil. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said to his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, "We're truly at an unprecedented stage in the development of our strategic relations of a comprehensive partnership." Wang said that Beijing is willing to work with Russia to further strengthen bilateral comprehensive strategic coordination. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the two sides also exchanged views on Ukraine crisis and the situation on the Korean Peninsula. China and Russia declared a no-limits partnership when Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Beijing less than 3 weeks before his troops marched into Ukraine in February of 2022, triggering the deadliest land war in Europe since World War II.